So once again, welcome everybody to the IACT IMDHA Presenter Series. We're getting ready for the HypnoExpo, which is May 21st through the 23rd online, followed by, or preceded and followed by pre and post conference programs. And we're interviewing in this series people that are offering those particular programs. And our next guest is Fredric Mau. And I got to tell you, Fredric has a special distinction. I don't know if he really realizes it within the association, because last year, I remember that we had less than a month to move from what we were going to be doing in a live conference to going online. And Fredric is the guy who presented the first piece that I'm aware of at a hypnosis conference about COVID itself. So interesting segue that we get to do that. But let me tell you about this fella. He's an international keynote speaker. He is generally a science-based speaker. This particular program that he's going to be doing here, however, really is uses practical skills of hypnotherapy and helping clients. But this guy is received a number of professional awards for his careful and empirical research studies, as well as for his work as a clinical mental health counselor. As I mentioned, he did do the first COVID presentation, and here we are again. Now his presentation this time, which is also on Monday, the 24th, it's called Future Now, 300 Milliseconds and the Failure of Cognitive Change. That is an incredible title. So first of all, Fredric, let me just welcome you and tell you how glad we are to have you with us.
Michael, thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me along. And you've been, you and Robert have been very generous. So thank you. I appreciate that. Well, the COVID thing last year, you mentioned that. That was really on psychoneuroimmunology. And I actually came down with COVID back in March, and kind of went back to that thinking about it, that, you know, the major way COVID kills you is a cytokine storm where your immune system just wildly overreacts to the disease. And I remember thinking, okay, I've got this, and I really need to be calm, because I need to communicate to my body calm, because my body does not need to be overreacting with this stuff. And so it was a matter of sort of, oh, what did I put in that presentation last year? I had to think about that. Oh yeah, this will be helpful.
Yeah. Well, listen, by the way, I realize as we just made this transition that I need to reintroduce Karen, because she is the co-host in this conversation. So welcome back again, Karen Hand. And Fredric, I just want to ask you particularly, I love this title, and it's so intriguing because 300 milliseconds and the failure of cognitive change. What's the 300 milliseconds about?
Your body is constantly keeping track of everything going on around you. It's really about the perceptual system. So there's a part of you that's keeping track of all sensory input, peripheral vision, smell, you know, sensations of your shoes, everything that's going on. And the part of you that's doing that is actually your limbic system. So limbic is stress, anxiety, fight or flight. It's the part of you in charge of your survival and keeping you safe. If you drew a line between your ears and straight back from your eyes, where that crosses is where all this sits. And that limbic system processing is actually operating faster than cognitive processing. So cognitive processing is your frontal lobe, big walnut looking part of the brain up here. That limbic system processing is operating faster. So an illustration would be, you're driving down the freeway and someone swerves into your lane. Immediately you do like 5 different things to avoid the wreck. You don't think about any of them because there's no time. If you actually thought about it, you would crash. And so you jiggle the wheel, maybe pump the brake, check the mirror. There's all kinds of stuff that goes on. Limbic processing doesn't think, it operates off of habit. So when athletes talk about muscle memory, they're talking about really the same thing. And it's why new drivers are so dangerous. If someone goes to swerve into your lane and you're just learning to drive, your limbic system goes, oh, there's a problem, I need to grab something to do. And there's like no package there to grab. But the thing is that processing is operating like 300 milliseconds ahead of cognitive processing. That's like the perceptual lag. And 300 milliseconds is enough time to notice. I mean, it's not like a nanosecond, which is like a physics construct. 300 milliseconds is like a third of a second. And that's the difference between a cognitive process and an emotional process. So when you think about something like anger, anger is the default human response to stress. Toddlers get angry and they do it great, but no one sits around and goes, you know what? I'm going to get angry now. You're just like, anger happens, and then you notice it cognitively. And the reason you notice it cognitively is because it happened 300 milliseconds ago. And so that 300 milliseconds is about that, the speed of that limbic processing that's just minimally 300 milliseconds out ahead of cognitive processing. For certain things, it can be 700 milliseconds or even more than a second. So that's it's how fast your emotions are processing ahead of like thought.
Beats the heck out of Pentium.
Fredric, I hear a lot of people talk about, the limbic system and all of that, and that telling me right where it is. That gave me a great visual. I love that. Is that the same thing as the reptilian brain?
Usually when people talk about the reptile brain, they're talking about actually even deeper structures in the brain, like the medulla oblongata and stuff like that. Limbic is midbrain. And really is primarily emotional processing. So your amygdala would be part of the limbic system. Your hypothalamus, which is in charge of, well, think about these things. Think about stuff your clients work with, and think about this. Things like sweating, heartbeat, respiration, sleep cycle, sexual responses. Hypothalamus is involved in all of that stuff. Really important is your anterior cingulate cortex. If you're only going to keep up with one of these structures, that actually, not the amygdala, honestly, the anterior cingulate's the one to watch. That one's involved in emotions of horror and trauma, also addictive behaviors, and really anything that looks voluntary but doesn't feel voluntary. So it really is the part of you that's in charge of your survival and keeping you safe. The quote unquote reptile brain is more like just straight up autonomic body function.
Okay. I appreciate you clearing that up, because we hear all these terms thrown out sometimes, and I just want to make sure that I'm following, not taking this person's information and, mixing it up with yours.
There you go.
Speaking of all these terms that we hear all the time, I'm just really anxious about this, and I'm looking forward to hearing your response to it. You've been rethinking the nature of hypnosis and therapeutic change, including some basic concepts like conscious and unconscious. And I'm fascinated with this because there is, there's a particular group on Facebook that I spend quite a bit of time around, and this discussion keeps coming up and coming up, because some people are saying there is no such thing as the unconscious mind, and other people are, and I'm like, well, yeah, I would get involved in this discussion, but I'm really busy working with clients right now.
I am so busy working with clients right now, and honestly, listening to the last presentation, which thank you. I mean, I have never been busier in my practice. We have anxiety disorders through the roof. I've been talking to colleagues, and with all the distancing and stuff that's gone on, I believe we're going to be seeing a lot more attachment disorders where people have trouble with trust and secure relationships. Mm-hmm. And so the mental health consequences of all this have been through the roof. And yeah, practice, I'm not complaining that my practice has been busy, but I am not at all happy with why. But it's been a phenomenally busy year because there are a lot of people hurting. Yeah. And so, Karen, I think you and Ashley, that sounds like an excellent program. And I think a lot of people are going to benefit with that.
Thank you, Fredric.
Thank you. So conscious and unconscious, I think as time goes on, our terminology becomes finer. If you want to write your steampunk novel and set it way back in the day, you talk about someone dying of consumption. And really what you're probably talking about is cancer. And we can say that consumption is cancer, but like we really didn't know, when they were talking about consumption, they didn't know what it was. Like they didn't know what was going on. I remember one time I had a question asked about, does addiction appear in the Bible? And I'm like, well, you know, if you're talking about like the 1st century AD, they don't, the cultural constructs that you need to understand addiction as a concept didn't exist. Like it wasn't, you can talk about these behaviors that were happening, but the concept of addiction and the understanding of it, not something that was even around. That actually began with Benjamin Rush, by the way, who was one of the signers of the American Declaration of Independence. With thinking about the conscious and unconscious mind, I really am ending up sort of falling away from that terminology. And in fact, I've found over recently, I've been like beginning presentations with just telling people, look, if I start saying these couple of things, just translate it into conscious and unconscious mind. So the couple of things are cognitive processing or cognition. So that's basically front brain, frontal lobe, also including your prefrontal cortex, but that cognitive processing is conscious decision-making processing. And I think really grasp what we've traditionally talked about in terms of the conscious mind, cognition. And then I tend to think of the alternative to that as being limbic or emotional processing. And I really do think it's about that midbrain limbic region processing. And so I end up talking a lot about cognitive processing and limbic processing, or cognitive processing and emotional processing. And I think at a brain level that at this point, that's what we've realized is going on with these processes. It's about engaging these different regions of the brain. I know with like Dave Ellman's model that, you know, he distinguished between the subconscious and the unconscious. And the unconscious was the part that was running like a lot of body responses, body experiences, that kind of thing. I think what we would refer to really as somatic issues. And I think all of that is sort of wrapped into limbic processing, both the Ellman construction of the sort of the subconscious with like these emotional drivers that are going on for behavior, but then also deeply involved emotions. Emotions drive behavior. Emotions are body experience. And these body factors like functional neurological issues, what we called conversion disorders, or used to be called hysteria, like hysterical blindness. These are all like, it's all limbic system processing that's driving that. So the more we've looked at like imaging of the living human brain during hypnotic processes, I think the more the nature of the processes is really understood, and that we can begin to talk about these things in a lot more precise and finer way. So conscious mind is basically, to my mind, sort of archaic terminology for cognitive processing, which is essentially frontal lobe processing. And subconscious or unconscious mind is essentially archaic terminology for limbic or emotional processing.
Nice. Yeah. And we know so much more about the brain and neuroscience and everything else that it becomes time, doesn't it, to start redefining our language and using a different model. It's like if you look at a map, if you look at a map now and look at a map from the 1930s and compare them, the places are still there, you know, but now we have different ways to talk about them, different ways to refer to them. And
yeah, I was at the museum on yesterday, on Sunday, and they had a globe there from I guess the 1700s. Wow. And like Africa was real big, and I think Australia was part of Antarctica, and like the Sea of Cortez went all the way up basically to Vancouver. It was
well, things do change.
Was it round? Was it round?
It was round. It was a globe. And I'm not faulting the people in the 1700s, just like I'm not faulting people like, I think Ellman's model has a lot to commend it. I'm not trying to take anything away from that model. And Ellman did not have the advantage of, for example, of looking at neuroimaging. And probably smarter than me and probably had neuroimaging, would like have defined these a lot better than I have.
Sure.
I have tremendous respect for folks that have come before. I'm an Ericksonian hypnotist, and I have tremendous respect for Milton Erickson, who never had a clue about any of this kind of stuff happening.
Right.
So it's the we stand on the shoulders of giants thing. We get to get perspective that they didn't have, but that doesn't mean that they weren't really smart.
Yeah.
And
Right.
like paved the
Standing,
way.
standing on their shoulders, we can see farther, can't we?
Yeah,
As
yeah,
Michael often points out, these people died 50 years ago. If they were still alive, Elman, Erickson, if they were still alive, they'd be doing it differently today too. They would have.
I mean, I think so. Well, I think fundamental things would be similar, but I mean, I can see either one of them being the kind of thinkers that would sharpen their terminology.
Right. You wrote an article for The Unlimited Human that's really dear to my heart, that kind of challenges depth testing and that kind of thing. Let's talk a little bit about that.
So yeah, I've not only been thinking suggestibility, which we probably ought to talk about in a minute, as a different thing from depth, but also the notion of depth. And what we mean by depth, and there are views of hypnosis that say you've got to have great depth in order to achieve like hypnotic results and that kind of thing. And so I've kind of asked myself the question, like, what is depth and what are we actually talking about? We've had depth scales since probably the 1930s. I list some of them in the article. We've had really pretty good scales, like with the Stanford scale of hypnotic suggestibility for a while. There's the Aaron scale, Harry Aaron's from 1961. That's the 6-point scale that you learn in all the guild classes and stuff. And so these things the terminology gets mixed. Depth, suggestibility, susceptibility is another one that gets thrown in there with that. But when I really ask myself the question, what is going on with depth? I think what we're talking about with depth is the subjective perception of dissociation.
Mm-hmm.
So inherent in a hypnotic process is dissociation. And dissociation is not pathological. I mean, if you've ever been like reading a book and like all of a sudden you realize, man, I am going to have to turn on the lamp because the sun is totally gone down and I can't see the page anymore. Or you've had like highway hypnosis. I drove here, but I don't remember the trip, but I obviously did everything right because I'm here and I'm safe. Like those would be examples of dissociation where we're not totally engaged in what's around us, but we're doing the things that we need to. A lot of that is limbic processing where things are running kind of on autopilot, but that dissociation. Now, when you look at things like trauma, dissociation is inherent in post-traumatic responses that are clinical. And there is, of course, peritraumatic dissociation that's a major concern. Like a key example of that would be something like dissociative identity disorder, which people used to call multiple personality disorder. But dissociation is an inherent characteristic in hypnotic processes. And it seems to be associated in terms of hypnosis with brainwave cycle, which is an old model and a very accurate model, but a way of looking at hypnotic depth is, how slow is my brainwave cycle going? Alpha, beta, theta, delta, like those levels. And so there's actually a scale to measure depth called the bispectral index scale that's approved by the FDA and uses EEG. I don't have one sent in my office, but they use it for people under general anesthesia with the goal of assessing cognitive awareness during surgery, because you don't want someone to be zapped out in the sense that they can't move and let you know anything, but they're still feeling you cut on them. Like that would be a bad thing if you're a surgeon. And so the bispectral index scale is a scale that keys off of EEG as a way of measuring cognitive awareness. And so I'm thinking depth is mostly the perception of dissociation. As such, I'm not thinking it's particularly important for accomplishing a whole lot of anything. It gives a great experience, and it's kind of a yeehaw. If you've got great depth, then obviously you can like anchor off of that and stuff. But if your client doesn't experience a lot of dissociation, I don't think that is at all an impediment to facilitating change using relaxation. Because the stuff that creates change is not the dissociation, or at least not entirely that. I guess one other thing to say in here is I've run into some viewpoints that hypnosis is essentially compliance. By people that are not saying there's no such thing as hypnosis, but just that like hypnosis is just compliance. And that is maybe the worst view, because hypnosis is a lot of things, but it is not about cognitive compliance. I'm convinced of that's not what's going on. So as we begin to talk about suggestibility, which is one thing, depth, which I think is another thing, I'm not sure that the subjective perception of depth is particularly important clinically, although it's fun. So I don't know if I stirred the pot too much there, or even if I was clear, but there you go.
Let me just punch a thought in here. I remember when I was first being trained in hypnosis, and I had a friend who wanted to do a past life regression, and I was like really new, and I thought, well, okay, but if he wants to go way back, I mean, this is how naive I was. I figured the farther back he wants to go, the deeper in hypnosis he would need to be. So what I did was I compounded this induction where he was resting underneath a beautiful shade tree and feeling the comfort and getting, relaxed, kind of a progressive relaxation sort of thing that I did. And while he was resting underneath that tree, he fell into a dream, and in the dream, a hypnotist came to see him and started counting backwards from 10 to, and all of these things, everything that I could do to get as much depth as I could possibly get. And finally, I got him to this place where now theoretically he was going to touch down in a previous life or something and have something to report. So I'm ready. I've asked him, so tell me, look around and tell me what you see. And as though he had taken a 78 RPM record and played it at 33 1/3, he said to me, "I'm so heavy," and he couldn't even communicate. So I learned a lesson about depth pretty early, that and that kind of thing can, in some cases, really inhibit the process and get in the way.
I had a pain relief client the other day that had had trouble with hypnotic processes before and that kind of thing. And, I really wanted a nice deep experience and wanted to get pain relief. And I figured there's no kill like overkill. So I just did like 3 inductions and then did pain relief. And it worked great. I mean, the guy was like down. I wasn't asking him to respond like with a regression, so I didn't run into any of those kind of problems. I think part of this, though, is the framing and like both the expectation of the hypnotist and the client. If you think you've got to have depth in order to get further back, then the likelihood is you're going to need depth in order to get further back, because that's the story, the metaphor that you've planted. Remember, I'm an Ericksonian. Mm-hmm. So generally what I tell my clients is, this is probably the only learning method in the world where we will tell you, please don't pay attention to what I'm saying. You can totally daydream, beach, mountains, dog, cat. You want to think about a shopping list, go for it. I'd rather think about the beach, whatever knocks you out. A lot of people zone out and don't have any idea what I said, which is kind of awesome. Some people feel like they're hearing everything I say, totally fine. Some people feel like they're in and out and back and forth. That's great too. Mm-hmm. Your subjective experience really doesn't matter as far as the success of the process. What we're going to look for is what happens when you come in next time. And by framing it that it's not tied to subjective experience, what we're doing is avoiding a place that can just be a trip up. Like if the client doesn't experience great depth, then dissociation again, then they're going to think the process didn't work. Well, the process may have worked fine. Like we may have dealt with the weight loss issue or nail biting or getting rid of the anxiety or whatever it was, but they're not assessing based on what happens retrospectively following the session, post-hypnotically, which is what you're after. They're assessing like experience. I remember a client that I had way back when I was first in practice. I was actually in another guy's practice, and he sold these like 6-month-long weight loss programs and stuff that were just insane. And this woman came in and she was like this, and the chair just like that. Most people are like, she was like, ah. And she goes, I don't think you've been hypnotizing me. And I went, I thought that, I didn't do that. And I said, well, how much weight have you lost? And she goes, I'm in 3 dress sizes. And I'm like, is it okay if I keep not hypnotizing you if you keep losing weight? Yeah. And she just laughed and went, okay. And I'm like, all right, well, go for that. But I think if you center your client on the perception of depth or dissociation as a hallmark of success, then if they experience that, yes, you've just anchored in something that's going to play toward their success. But if they don't happen to experience it, then you've kind of shot yourself in the foot in a way that you really didn't need to.
Mm-hmm.
I've often thought that the induction is more for the hypnotist than the client. It's to give the hypnotist the feeling that they've done something.
You know, I mean, one of the things I tell new hypnotists, Karen, is don't get lost in like the romance of induction. Like I can teach you an induction in half an hour. It's no big deal. The real skill that we have is the ability to use language in emotionally suggestive ways. And getting down that skill of how to use language in a way that facilitates change, I think that's like the key. So yeah, like I can bore someone out, no worries on that. Yeah, like being able to facilitate change, that's what you're after.
Well, you were coupling this to depth and suggestibility. So let's look at suggestibility a bit.
Well, I think suggestibility actually is a totally different thing. And I think that one is actually really well understood. The depth thing is kind of me mentally playing with it and kind of seeing where we're getting. But I think suggestibility, we now have nailed that down. There have been several neuroimaging studies on this. Basically, people that are more highly suggestible. And so what I mean by that is they test at greater depth on like the Stanford scale. So people that are more highly suggestible have a greater functional connection between two particular brain regions, the prefrontal cortex, which is an executive control region right up here, and your anterior cingulate cortex, which I mentioned a minute ago is one of those limbic structures back in the midbrain. Those things are really hardwired together in the primate brain anyway. But for people that are very highly suggestible, they tend to both fire at the same time. They're like both engaged at the same time. And the interesting thing is, while that is not true of the general population and is not true of a number of mental issues like schizophrenia spectrum or autism, it is true of people that suffer anxiety disorders, depression, psychogenic seizures, post-traumatic responses that are clinical. So basically, if you think about sort of the big umbrella of like anxiety-related issues, people that have that same brain connection between the prefrontal and the anterior cingulate, those are the people that exhibit those anxiety responses. And they're also the people that are more highly suggestible. So when someone comes into my practice and goes, "You think you can hypnotize me?" I'm like, "Well, you got an anxiety issue, so yes." Because the first indicator that someone's going to be highly hypnotizable is that they got an anxiety issue or a post-traumatic issue that's clinical. So that was shorthand. It's not actually the way the conversation precisely goes with the client, but you get the point that's there.
Yeah.
So suggestibility, I think, is a different thing from depth. I mean, whatever's going on with depth, suggestibility is all about disengagement of the frontal, that link between the prefrontal and the anterior cingulate, and that also ties in with anxiety, clinical anxiety issues.
Okay. One of the things that as you separating out suggestibility and depth here, I think one of the things that tends to hold them together in my thinking, I am as you are, I'm an Ericksonian, and my orientation really is there. But I've had numerous discussions with people in the sort of Elman school that insist on the need for somnambulism in order for suggestion to be able to work, and that seems to be the thing that puts depth and suggestion together.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an Ericksonian, and I actually would respectfully disagree with my colleagues on that one. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the major thing that happens in the connection with the client is pacing and leading. It's just it's what therapists call a therapeutic relationship, but the emotional rapport that you have with the client, and that level. Hypnosis is based on a relationship of mutual trust, because it has to be, because you've got to have that emotional link with the client. One of the things when I'm supervising counselors or when I'm working with hypnosis students, a point I'll make is like when you're talking with a client, you feel an emotional connection with the person. Like you can feel when the client's tracking with you. If you ever realize I'm not feeling that, then the first thing to do is just stop, because anything you do at that point, anything you say is just going to build resistance. It's going to be a problem. Like, it's not going to accomplish anything. So you want to stop, and you have to reacquire pacing and leading. Like, emotional connection has to be in place or nothing else happens. And so if I believe that certain things have to happen for our process to be okay, and I'm the hypnotist, then I think those things have to be in place for the process to work, because my belief becomes a part of like that emotional rapport and connection. Likewise, if the client believes certain things have to happen, then that has to happen. I had a client years ago, this is back when I had a business partner, who came in, and, you know, my partner said, can you work with her? I don't think I got anywhere last time. I'm like, okay. So the woman comes in, and was an older woman, very country. And I said, well, you know, how can I help you? And she's like, well, you could hypnotize me. And I'm like, well, that happened last time. She says, nah, he didn't hypnotize me. And I was thinking, well, that's weird, because that's what he does. So, well, what did he do? And she says, I don't know, but he didn't swing no watch. And I said, well, so like, to hypnotize you, I've got to swing a watch. And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, like, I don't have a watch, but I've got a pendulum. Will that do? And she's like, well, I suppose. And I'm like, okay. And so, you know, I don't do swinging watch inductions with clients like it, but I was like, here we go. She expected that had to be in place in order for change to happen. And so if you're the hypnotist and you expect that something has to be in place in order for change to happen, then I think that becomes a part of the emotional communication in the process. But I'm not convinced that depth is necessary for change. Erickson did lots of stuff with what he called ordinary waking trance.
Sure.
And there's a lot you can do even in waking state with suggestibility that really creates change and alters things.
Well,
it's about the emotional change, not the depth.
Those expectations, definitely. And if you're emotionally attached to those expectations, that's going to put you in hypnosis.
Yeah.
Right.
Plus, there's a weirdness on the definition of somnambulism with this thing, because when I listen to my colleagues talking about that, and to be honest with you, most of the people I'm listening to on this are not speaking English as a first language, and that's okay. Like, I have huge respect for my international colleagues. I love going over there and speaking at those conferences, but somnambulism basically means sleepwalking, and that's not what they're talking about. Yeah. They're talking about something that's different. And so you get this stuff about somnambulism and like an estale state. And I mean, I don't know. I'm looking for operational definitions. Like, how exactly do we tell the difference? And as near as I can tell, the way we tell the difference is we do inductions where we have the client do stuff, and so that I, as the hypnotist, can kind of have a gauge on what I think their depth is. The problem with those inductions is if they don't work, like if the numbers don't disappear or whatever, then the client thinks they failed. Right. I'm not interested in doing a process that sets my client up to where they can mess up so they think they failed, especially if I don't think that whatever it is that I'm supposed to see is real important anyway, since, again, I'm an Ericksonian, and like, you can do plenty of fine stuff in like real light levels. But I don't know. Did that help?
Yeah, that helps quite a bit. Because, by the way, and when the numbers disappear, by the way, because I have imagined them out of my mind, I certainly would never call that amnesia.
No, well, no, but and I don't mean to be picking nits here, but the problem is, I basically want to frame everything so that the client can't fail and I can't fail.
Yes.
Whatever it's like an illusion of choice process. Whatever happens, I want to be able to pick up anything from that worked, focus on exceptions that are moving in the right direction, and move everything forward. And so I'm not interested in putting something out there that the client is going to be able. If the client fails at something, I want it to be our mission. If our mission is get rid of these, panic attacks, then failure would be, at the end of the day, we were ultimately not able to get rid of the panic attacks. I don't care about what subjective experience they had or any of that kind of stuff. Right. Does that make sense? And again, I'm not, different people have different views. I'm not like, if you're sitting there going, well, you've got to have somnambulism in an estale state, I'm fine. If like, that's your approach,
go for it.
Go for it. I'm not, my goal is not to be critical, but I am suggesting that other models also work.
Sure. Well, by the way, in your title, if I can unpack this again, we've got 300 milliseconds and the failure of cognitive change. So I want to hear a little bit about that. What is the failure of cognitive change? Quite a phrase.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so limbic system processing is happening at least 300 milliseconds faster than cognitive processing. Limbic processing, the way I think of it is fast and vast. It's processing tons of information. Visual signals to the brain exceed 1 billion per second alone. That's not counting smell, tactile sensation, auditory processing, all of that kind of stuff. The amount of information that's coming in, it's processed by essentially a salience network that's a limbic network involving the insula, the anterior cingulate, a couple of other structures. Like salience is the issue, like that sensation coming in, is it important or not? And remember, this is the part of you that's in charge of your survival and keeping you safe. And all this is happening on the front end. So here's my amazing magic trick. You're not aware of your shoes until I mention it. Now you feel your shoes. Or if you're not wearing shoes, you're aware you're barefooted or with socks or whatever it is. But you didn't feel your feet a minute ago. And the reason you didn't is because those signals are going to the brain, but the limbic's like nothing to see here, and not passing it up to cognition, because if it passed it up to the frontal lobe, like it would be overwhelming to constantly feel your hair, your clothes, your shoes, every smell in the room. It would be overwhelming. So limbic is processing really fast out in front of everything, and then taking to the cognitive portion what's important.
News of difference.
So emotional stuff happens on the front end. It's like I said at the beginning, no one decides to get angry.
Mhm.
You get angry, and then, so the failure of cognitive change, here's a straight up cognitive behavioral anger management model. Anger is the default human response to stress. So a stressor happens, and then I get angry. And then we work on a way to go back and manage the anger.
Right.
And people will come to me and say, do you do anger management? I always say yes, because I know what they mean. But like, how miserable does that sound? Who in the world wants to manage anger? I mean, God, very vexing.
Yeah.
So I think our model is different. A stressor happens. We want to work at an emotional level so that when that happens, the response is just different. We're engaging the client's creativity, the Ericksonian subconscious, the part of you that is in charge of like your growth and healing and that positive resources for change. We want to engage that emotional part of you so that when that stressor happens, instead of anger, which is not a particularly effective response most of the time, the problem with anger doesn't work real well.
Yeah.
It empowers other people. If you've got an issue with another person, that's usually a bad thing if you're getting angry. So the stressor happens. Instead of anger, we want to reset things so that at an emotional level, you just react differently in a way that's better. And you decide that, like your creative subconscious. I don't tell you what to do. I want to do a process that engages that Ericksonian subconscious, that creativity, so a different thing happens. So anger didn't happen. So we don't have to manage it, which that's cool. And the original stressor got handled better, so that's cool. And that's the failure of cognitive change. Here's the deal. Cognitive change is about managing problems after they happen. It's techniques and stuff to manage problems. What we do offers the opportunity to get back behind things at an emotional level so the problems don't happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did that make sense?
That makes great sense. Well, I'm afraid that we're getting really close to the end of the time already. It's amazing how fast it goes. It went by like 300 milliseconds, you know. But
yes, it's right there.
But I'll tell you something. I want to ask you, for people that are considering this class. I always have a concern on these interviews that basically what we're going to get is we're going to get a commercial for a class and not stuff that really is useful. And instead, both with Karen and Ashley tonight and with the conversation with you here, we've talked about some fascinating things, and I really appreciate it. But I got to give you a chance to actually advertise the class. So what's the class going to be like? So if I sign up, I'm going to show up at the class, and is it going to be a lot of lecture? Is it going to be, what's going to happen?
We're going to talk some of the neurology in a little more detail and give you the models that I think make sense and are kind of helpful. I think it is sort of helpful to understand how things function. And to have a model that's based in reality, not just like a kind of an I think it's this way kind of thing. But I also like to spend a good bit of time like actually talking client cases and interventions and stuff that works. So we can model some things, we can talk through some interventions, we can talk through stuff that actually works with clients. Because you want to have something that puts like feet on it, and so you're able to, to go and get that done. So talking about like kinds of metaphors you can use, or you can say, I had a client and this happened. All right, well, let's talk about that. How can we work it in a way that's going to be successful? I think putting the feet on it in that way is very important.
Okay, great. So, well, what else you got going on? What's happening with Fredric? You've got some other things in the works that we should know about?
The thing I'm most excited about right now, I've actually been invited to join in with a research group out of Clemson University, which is they win football games, but they're also a major research university, and Prisma Health, which is a major teaching hospital chain here in South Carolina. We're working on virtual reality for pain relief. And so I'm getting to work with all these cool virtual reality guys, which I didn't know a whole lot about, but it's like awesome. And then I'm the guy that's supposed to put together the process that's going to be like within the virtual reality to actually get rid of the pain. And I had to sell them on the idea of, we're not trying to manage pain, guys. We want to get rid of it. And it's been some jumps. And I had a talk with a guy, and he's like, this is a completely different way of thinking and understanding the world than I've ever thought of before. It's just upside down from anything I've thought of. And I'm like, yes, but we can totally get rid of the experience of pain. So I'm very excited. Pain relief is one of the best things you can do for your clients. If you don't do it, please do. Make sure the doctor diagnoses it first, so you're not numbing something that like the person needs to like medically take care of. But they got a herniated disc, an injury, migraine, something like that. Like, for goodness sake, pain relief is almost inherent in our processes, even if you don't suggest it. And it's so simple that even direct suggestion tends to work, and it's super helpful. And if someone's got like an anxiety issue or something, like getting rid of pain is like phenomenal. So look up some pain relief processes, do your clients a favor. Like, pain relief is awesome. But I'm excited about that project. Also excited about speaking at our conference. So that'll be great coming up.
Lovely. Yes, it will be. And by the way, it is coming up. It's just around the corner. May 21st, 2nd, and 3rd is the weekend. And Fredric's program, Future Now, 300 Milliseconds and the Failure of Cognitive Change, is a one-day Monday on May 24th. So everybody, make that phone call. Call the association at 570-869-1021 to register, or you can register online. But by all means, do one of those things. Fredric, we're at the end of our time, so I've just got to tell you how much I appreciate you being here with us tonight and sharing all this stuff. You've got my mind working, so maybe while I'm sleeping tonight, I'm going to wake up in the morning with some synapses connected in new and interesting ways, and that will be fascinating. So thanks a lot for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks,
You'll feel better and more creative, and thank you.
Okay, all right.
Appreciated having you.
Okay, and everybody, so you can give a round of applause. Yeah, I'm seeing the hands for our presenters this evening, and this is the last evening of the presenter series. So next Monday night, you're going to have to find something else to do, or you can just sit back and review the recordings from the presenter series that we've done already, or any that you've missed. They are posted, as we have said, on the IMDHA website. I'm sorry, the catalog. I'm confused, Linda.
I said, or the catalog.
Yes, by all means. So it's all right there. Learning Reimagined live online, May 21st and the 23rd, and as you know, the 24th as well, and the days before. So thanks everybody for being a part.
And while you're planning your world, be sure you join us the second Tuesday of next month for the virtual chapter.
Yes.
We will have Susie Day on, talking about being a motorcycle mama. Boots on the ground and head in the clouds.
Excellent. Yes, the motorcycle mama hypnotist. So this is very good. Looking forward to it.
Fredric.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Robert, thank you so much. Michael, thank you. Karen, thank you. I
Thank
really
you,
appreciate
Fredric.
it. Thank
See
you.
you soon.
It was an honor.
Good night.
Oh, my honor. Thank you.
Thank you.